and recapitalization of the North American Development Bank. If funds were only authorized, as Senator Toomey has suggested, there'd be no guarantee that we'd be able to fulfill the commitments made in the USMCA, and the credibility of our good faith negotiations with Mexico and Canada is the presumption that we will carry out this agreement and carry it out year after year after year. Besides, historically, all trade bills result in changes to federal spending and revenue. This bill has the benefit of reducing the deficit, even with the funds discussed by Senator Toomey. Striking the emergency designation could lead to a sequestration of discretionary funding, as regular appropriations for fiscal years 2020 have already been enacted. The emergency designation is, in this precise context, and a very precise context, considered strictly necessary or appropriate under Section 103 of the Trade Promotion Authority 2015. Here is the oddity of the senator's argument. If Senator Toomey is suggesting funds be authorized, I think he inherently agrees that enforcement funding is either strictly necessary or appropriate to implement the USMCA. This is a very important clarification to make. Trade promotion language is, quote, strictly necessary or appropriate, end of quote. It's for Congress, then, to decide what is strictly necessary or appropriate. The Finance Committee, with jurisdiction over the entire bill, the Budget and the Appropriations Committees, with jurisdiction over the language at issue, voted overwhelmingly to support the bill. It's important to note that the final appropriation was significantly reduced in consideration of concerns about spending, including my own concerns. Finally, I'd also like to emphasize that this was a negotiated outcome which was necessary to achieve the broad bipartisan support that this bill is going to get, and particularly to get it initiated through the House of Representatives. I'm satisfied with the final outcome, so I'll make a motion to waive the point of order if it's made, and I would urge my colleagues to support waiving the point of order and to vote yes for the USMCA so we can deliver a victory for the American people.
Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
I would ask unanimous consent to speak to 1 minute, and then Senator Toomey would proceed with the procedural question at hand.
Without objection.
Madam President, first I want to make sure that we can enter into the record the thanks that is deserved to the bipartisan team here in the Senate that has made this day possible. And second, one substantive point, because I associate myself with the remarks of Chairman Grassley. I think we need to understand that what the Toomey procedural issue is all about is it's really a Trojan horse for rolling back an aggressive effort to enforce rights that workers care about and we all care about with respect to our land, air, and water. I know the senator from Pennsylvania disagrees with it. I just wanted to make that point. The chairman is right with respect to the procedure. I just wanted people to understand what the substantive issue is. And this is just a policy disagreement, and that's what the Senate's all about. I yield.
Madam President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
2 quick points, and I'll get to the point of order. First of all, I disagree with the chairman. I do think that the spending in this bill is neither strictly necessary nor appropriate, but that's not what this point of order is about. If my point of order is sustained and the motion that is going to be made by the chairman were to be rejected, not a penny is reduced in spending of this bill, which is why I couldn't disagree more with my colleague from Oregon to suggest it's a Trojan horse for something. It doesn't cut spending by a dime from this bill. It simply means that by the end of the fiscal year, Congress will have to find an offset for this very, very modest amount of money. It's an attempt to try to enforce some kind of compliance. And so, Madam President, Pursuant to Section 314E of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, I raise a point of order against the emergency designation on page 233, lines 4 through 8 of H.R. 5430.
I object, and
Senator from Iowa.
pursuant to Section 904 of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 and the waiver provisions of applicable budget resolutions, I move to waive all applicable sections of that act and applicable budget resolution for purposes of H.R. 5430, and I ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The nays and yeas are ordered.
Madam President,
Senator from Kansas.
Madam President, thank you. I would ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 474 submitted earlier today.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 474 to authorize representation by the Senate Legal Counsel in the case of Martin F. McMahon versus Senator Ted Cruz et al.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
Madam President, I then ask for unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President,
Senator from Kansas.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate Resolution 3201 introduced earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S 3201, a bill to extend the temporary scheduling order for fentanyl-related substances and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
Then I would ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Madam President,
Senator from Kansas.
I finally ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Veterans Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S 3084 and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
S 3084, a bill to amend Title 38 United States Code to modify the limitation on pay for certain high-level employees and officers of the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
Then, Madam President, I would
It is
ask...
discharged and Senate will proceed.
Thank you. I then would ask, Madam President, that unanimous consent be granted, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
And finally, Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Judiciary be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 886 and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 886, an act to direct the Attorney General to establish and carry out a veteran treatment court program.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the committee is discharged. And we will proceed to the measure.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask now unanimous consent that the McSally Amendment at the desk be agreed to, and that the bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection. All time has expired.
Questions on the motion to waive.
Questions on the measure to waive.
Yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
The yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Brown, Coons, Durbin, Ernst, Grassley, Hyde-Smith, Jones, Moran, Murray, Rounds, Shaheen, Smith, Thune, Udall, and Wyden. Mr. Toomey voted in the negative. Mr. Blunt, aye. That's a Mr. Sass, no. Is Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. No, it's not. Sure. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. I did not. Let's have her look at me so that she gets it. Mrs. Leffler, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Yes, sir. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Casey, aye.
Except until all these juniors decide if they're going to grow or not. Like it doesn't mean. What are they asking?
Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Gardner,
I think we played y'all at home.
no. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Enzi,
My daughter loves Joe Burrow.
no.
If he proposed, she would say yes.
Mr. Reed,
Ms. Salazar, the correct answer is.
aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Tillis, no.
Are you a Mississippi?
Mr. Peters,
Aye.
aye. Mr. Wicker,
Person likes to know.
aye.
That's a good thing. The woman who's my
Mr. Lee,
Louisiana mother.
no. Ms. McSally, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Cotton,
Which, again, the Texans are trying to kind of.
Mr. Cotton, aye.
We got beat.
Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Lankford, no. It- Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. Daines. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Mr. Perdue. No. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Mr. Braun. No. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Mr. Kennedy. No. Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Young. No. Mr. Barrasso. No. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mrs. Fisher. No. Oh, Ms. Harris. Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber that wish to vote or wish to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 78, the nays are 21. 3/5 of senators duly chosen and sworn have voted in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to, and the point of order fails. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
Calendar number 406, H.R. 5430, an act to
Looks like
implement
we're
the
too late.
agreement between the United States of America, the
Okay.
United Mexican States, and Canada, attached as an annex to the protocol replacing the North American Free Trade Agreement.
The Senate will be in order.
Mr. President,
The senator from Iowa.
I ask unanimous consent for 30 seconds for me and 1 minute for Senator Wyden for closing remarks.
Without objection.
The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement is a major achievement for President Trump and a very big bipartisan win for the American people. We should all take care, Republican or Democrat, that this is good. I look forward to signing this bill and sending it to the President's desk. I yield the floor.
President,
Senator from Oregon.
when the Trump administration unveiled their original version of this proposal, it was stunning to see how weak it was in terms of trade enforcement. When you write a proposal with weak trade enforcement, particularly on labor and environmental issues, you sell out American workers and you launch a corporate race to the bottom of cheap wages and the treatment of labor. Senator Brown and I decided that was unacceptable, and we were going to create a trade enforcement regime with real teeth. We worked with senators here, we worked with senators on the other side of the aisle and in the other body. To give you an example of what this means with respect to enforcing trade law, we sped up the timeline by more than 300%. Second point, just very quickly, what this proposal does is it brings technology and trade policy into the 21st century. When the last North American Free Trade Agreement was considered, nobody had a smartphone. So what we did is we protected intellectual property, we prohibited shakedowns of data belonging to innovative companies, and on something I care deeply about, we drew on established U.S. law to defend small tech entrepreneurs working to build successful companies in a field dominated by Goliaths. I urge my colleagues to support this proposal and once again thank Bob Lighthizer, the hardest working man in the trade agreement business. I urge a yes vote.
The question is on the passage of the bill. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal.
It's for everything, but you can follow along. It has separate numbering for
Mr. Blunt.
Aye. Yes, sir. You can call him the senator from Iowa or the president pro tempore. Is this your working draft?
Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman.
They do. Easier to name the cities that don't have it. Watercress. I got a VAL, pretty sure here.
Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown.
Non-campus fire safety.
Mr. Burr.
Isn't that just-
Ms. Cantwell.
I know we've done some weird stuff.
Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton.
Send this through. It's on tape.
Did you take it out? Mr. Kramer.
Send this through. Just get it out.
Mr. Crapo.
Treat yourself to something nice.
Yeah, it's like, all right, I'll be on the back side. I'm gonna drop this stuff off.
Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst.
People. Well, one of them is my uncle. I don't know how other people, they have senators have tickets.
And
But I have one ticket and I get
Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Daines, Durbin, Enzi, Ernst, Feinstein, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Langford, Leahy, Manchin, McSally, Menendez, Moran, Murphy, Murray, Hall, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Warner, Warren, Wicker, Wyden, Young. Ms. Smith? Aye. Mr. Peters? Aye. Mr. Udall? Aye. Mrs. Loeffler? Aye. Mr. Rubio? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Gillibrand, Harris, Reed, Schumer, Toomey, Whitehouse. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye.